Hello, welcome to the very first ceramic story time with Sue. So I am just going to give you some time to join this live video. So what's going to happen is I have a blog post that I wrote called A Low-Tech System for Recycling Clay Scraps. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to read that blog post to you live, and then I will take your questions. So if you can do me a favor, if you're here live, if you can just say hi in the chat. I'm using this program called Be Live that I've never used before that is going to allow me to share my screen with you. And then it's also supposed to show me your comments. So if you could just say hello in the chat and then let me know if you can see me and hear me. And then I will get started reading my blog post. So, oh, I see Lily. Okay. So, yay, you can hear me. Hi, Lily. Lily in Kamloops. Perfect. All right, so I can now get started. If you're just joining, please say hello in the chat. And I'm going to read my article called A Low-Tech System for Recycling Clay Scraps. So let me share my screen with you. Okay, so hopefully you can see me on the left and my website on the right. And let me just hide this. So if you want to follow along, you can go to this link, bit.ly, that's scrolling across the bottom of the screen, bit.ly/clay recycling. And then low res video, but we're here to listen. Okay. Okay, and I can't actually see your names when you're talking. It just says Facebook user. So I won't be able to see who is actually commenting. I have Facebook up on a different screen. Okay, so now I can see your names. So just give me a sec, figuring this all out. Okay, Russ, I see Russ and Kathleen. Yay, I'm so excited that you're here as well. So sorry if the video is low quality. Yeah, I'm not sure what's going on with that. I do have like a wired internet connection, so it's not Wi-Fi, but I'll just keep going and hopefully you can hear me just fine. So yeah, so if you want to follow along, you can click, go to this link and that'll bring you to my blog post. And then you can also download it, a PDF of this blog post if you like. So if you want to do that, then you just click the link, download this blog post as a PDF, and then you just have to enter your email address and it will send you the blog post as a PDF, and you can keep that in your files. So as I'm talking, feel free to ask any questions that you have, and then I will pause kind of at each section of the article to answer them. Okay, so a low-tech system for recycling clay scraps. So I wrote this article because a lot of people put off their clay recycling because it feels like this really big process that you have to do that takes a lot of space and it's super messy. And most people just put it off until they run out of clay, or they're forced to, their reclaim is taking up so much space. And so I actually developed this system in my home studio that doesn't take up a lot of space, and I can move my clay recycling around. And since I'm not in my studio as often as I would like to be, sometimes a lot of time goes by in between, like when I'm recycling. So I want to make sure that my reclaim doesn't dry out and all of that stuff. So I have this system that works really well for me. And then, and so I'll describe it in this article. So here we go. As clay artists, we're so lucky that we can reduce the amount of waste we produce by reclaiming or recycling our unfired clay. I use the words reclaim and recycle interchangeably. When we make something that cracks, warps, or doesn't look how we wanted it to, we can reclaim our clay, bringing it back to its original state so we can start over. As long as the clay hasn't been fired yet, it can be recycled. In this article, I'm going to describe the low-tech system that I use for recycling my clay scraps in my home studio. My home system is different than the system we use at the public studio where I work. The public studio has many different users, different clay bodies, and a big expensive machine called a pug mill that mixes our clay for us. I'll describe that system and how it's different in a separate article. But at home, I use a system that requires no fancy equipment, just a bit of time and effort. Plasticity versus short. So for a number of years, I was diligently going through the motions of reclaiming large buckets of clay scraps a couple of times per year. But I kept making one major mistake that resulted in really crappy, for lack of a better word, recycled clay. A better term for this crappy clay is short. Short is the word that is used to describe clay that has low plasticity, where clay is prone to cracking when bending, stretching, and shaping. If you roll a coil of clay and then bend it, it should bend nicely and not crack. If it does, it's considered short. The same goes for cutting a thick slab from a block of clay. If you bend it and stretch it, it shouldn't crack like this clay did in this photograph that you can see here. So this clay in this photograph is short. So you shouldn't be getting all of these cracking lines like along the edges and along the surface of the clay. It should bend and flex and be very plastic. So plastic is the opposite of short. Plasticity refers to a clay body's ability to be formed into a shape and to retain that shape. Clay is what's called a plastic material. I know it can be confusing to refer to clay as plastic when your brain has an idea of what plastic means. We might hear the word plastic and immediately think bad thoughts of killing the environment. But in ceramics, plastic equals good. Plasticity is not to be confused with elasticity. Elasticity refers to a material's ability to be stretched or deformed and then return to its original shape. Plasticity means it retains the new shape, so it doesn't bounce back. A clay body that has sufficient plasticity will not crack when it's bent or stretched. Here's a general description of how the plasticity of a clay body works. Wet clay particles attract each other like magnets. Water allows the particles to move and slide and stay stuck together as we shape the clay. The other thing that's required for plasticity is what's called clay particle size distribution. The better the distribution is of small, medium, and large clay particles, the more points of contact we have between all the particles, and the better our clay will stay stuck together. Here are some graphics to explain what I mean. Note that clay particles are flat and not round, but you get the idea. So here on the image on the left, this is just all large particles. And so you can see like the points of contact are less. And as we introduce medium-sized particles and then smaller particles, the points of contact between all the particles increases. So the more we have this diverse range of clay particle sizes, the more like if you think of them all like magnets attracting each other, the more our clay is going to stick together and hold up, and then it's not going to crack when you bend it or stretch it. So when we only have one size of clay particle, there are a lot of gaps in between them and less overall points of contact bonding the clay together. If we bend or stretch a clay body containing only one particle size, because there are fewer bonds, a lot of them will break, causing cracking. This is what happens when clay is short. When we have a mixture of particle sizes, the small and medium particles fill in all the gaps between the large particles, and now we have more points of contact holding the clay body together. Remember, wet clay particles attract each other like magnets, so the more points of contact, the stronger the overall bond throughout the clay body will be. When clay is short, it means there aren't enough points of contact holding the clay together. There are gaps that show up as cracks in the clay. Now, what the heck does this have to do with clay recycling, you might ask? Well, understanding how plasticity and clay particle size distribution work will help you to make sure that you're not producing short reclaimed clay like I was. So my big reclaiming mistake. I mentioned earlier that I kept making a major reclaiming mistake that resulted in short and unworkable clay. The mistake I kept making was I was discarding my throwing water. So do not throw away the contents of your throwing bucket. Let me explain the reason I was throwing this away and then why you should keep it. One time in my early days, before I understood how clay bodies and plasticity worked, I tried reclaiming just my throwing bucket. I poured the water off the top, spread the sludge onto a plaster slab, let it dry out a bit, and then tried working with it. The resulting clay was a cracking, crumbling mess for reasons that are now obvious to me. But because this process resulted in disaster, I decided that the clay in my throwing bucket was useless and problematic. So I stopped adding my throwing bucket to my reclaim bucket, and I just threw it into my discard bucket, where I dumped old glaze tests and clay that fell onto the dirty floor, etc. The issue and the benefit of the throwing sludge is that it contains the smallest clay particles. A lot of the tiniest particles are removed during the throwing process, and they end up in the throwing water. Without saving the throwing water, my reclaim bucket was lacking those smallest clay particles that contribute to the overall plasticity of the clay. I was throwing all of those small particles away and then complaining that my clay was crappy. Now that I know better, I keep absolutely everything. I keep my throwing bucket, the contents of my splash pans, any clay that comes off my thrown pots with a rib, they all go into my reclaim bucket. I don't worry about how much water ends up in there. When I need more space in the bucket and there's a lot of clear water on the top of the clay, I'll just siphon it off. Water is very good for clay recycling, and I'll explain why down below when I describe my whole reclaim process. If your throwing bucket has settled, so there's a layer of clear water on top, you can pour that off. Just don't remove any clay particles. If the water is cloudy, it's because of light floating clay particles. You want to keep the cloudy water, but if it's clear, then it can be poured or siphoned off the top. I hope you can learn from my mistakes and have the best recycled clay possible. To do so, just keep adding everything to your reclaim bucket and then follow my instructions below. What to do with short clay? If you have clay that you think is short and you're having trouble working with it, I would try mixing the short clay with some fresh clay out of the bag. I would start with half and half, and if it's still not better, mix some more fresh clay in. Hopefully that will work well enough that you can use up that short clay, and then your recycled clay will be better going forward. So here is my clay recycling system. I throw a very persnickety translucent porcelain off the hump, which means I can't compress the bottoms while throwing. So if my clay is short or not mixed well or off in any way, it will definitely let me know. It's important to me that my recycled clay isn't more persnickety than what I'm starting with. The system I use is thorough and may take more time than other ways of doing it. To me, it's worth the extra time and effort. Short clay is frustrating and consumes more of my energy. My system is also portable, which is great if you work in a small space like I do. There are many ways to reclaim your clay scraps, and you can adapt and create a system that works best for you. Tools and supplies. Here are the tools and supplies that I use. So first you need a bucket for your reclaim. You need a drill with a paint mixing attachment, a glazed sieve and a long-handled scrub brush, a plaster slab, a 38-liter blue Rubbermaid plastic tote. Optional, of course. This is exactly what I use. So you can use whatever works for you. Wooden blocks, a plastic squeeze clamps, and an old bed sheet. So step number 1 is to make a plaster slab. If you don't already have one, make a plaster slab that you can use to dry out your clay recycling. I made this one out of a pottery plaster that I bought from my ceramic supplier. I mixed up the plaster with water and poured a 2-inch layer straight into the bottom of the big blue Rubbermaid tote. The plaster then hardens, and because the tote is flexible and tapered, the slab pops right out. You can use other containers or cottle boards and clamps to make a plaster slab, whatever works for you. I use the same tote for pouring my plaster slab and my recycling process so they fit together perfectly. I made a few of these plaster slabs that I use both in my damp boxes and for recycling clay. So I have these damp boxes, which is another Rubbermaid container with a lid that has a layer of plaster on the bottom. And so when I'm throwing, when I want to keep things damp, I saturate the plaster with water, and then any pots that I put into this tote and close the lid, then they don't dry out. So I can take more time to kind of process if I'm making mugs and then I'm not going to make handles till next weekend, then I can keep my mugs nice and fresh until I have time to trim them and go through the rest of the process. So that's what a damp box is. If you've never made plaster before, search Google or YouTube, and there are plenty of articles and videos that can show you how. It's really easy. You just add water, mix, pour, and set. So every time I make plaster slabs, I did learn how while I was in school, but I don't make them very often. So every time I make them, I usually just Google it again just to get the ratio of plaster and water right, and just make sure I'm following the instructions. Okay, number 2, what to put in your reclaim bucket. Okay, I use a large bucket for my reclaim, one that's big enough to dump my splash pans into after throwing. A 10-gallon bucket works well for this. If you use different clay bodies, be sure to have a labeled bucket for each one. In the bucket, I dump my throwing water, my handle pulling water, the contents of my splash pans, any clay that comes off my thrown pots with a rib, my trimmings, my slab cutting scraps, etc. All of my clay scraps go into this reclaim bucket, wet or dry. With the throwing and handle pulling water, I usually allow the clay to settle overnight and pour the clear water off the top before dumping the clay sludge into the reclaim bucket. Any clay that has dried past the point of wedging, I let dry out completely, and then I throw the bone dry clay into the reclaim bucket. When bone dry clay comes into contact with water, it sucks it in like a sponge, and then it slakes down, turning to mush. I avoid adding leather hard pots or partially dried lumps of clay to my reclaim bucket. Since partially dry clay's pores already contain water, it doesn't absorb new water and won't slake down like bone dry clay does. It remains firm and unmixable. A mix of wet and dry trimmings are fine because they're so thin and have a lot of surface area. Just checking the comments. Carol says, how do I tune into this, Sue? Hopefully you're seeing the video of me talking. right now. I do see that it is low resolution. So I don't know why that is, but hopefully I can fix that for next time. Okay, mix your reclaim bucket, step number 3. Earlier in the article, I mentioned the importance of water for the reclaim process. If you want the best, highest plasticity clay possible, arguably even better than fresh clay out of the bag, then make sure your reclaim bucket always has plenty of water in it. You want to keep enough water in your reclaim bucket that there's always a layer of water sitting on top of the clay. This water does a couple of things. One reason is for when you have dry trimmings or scraps and dump them into the bucket, they hit the water and slake down instantly. But the more important reason is that liquid clay can flow and move and be mixed really well. Mixing is so important because you want all of the particles to be evenly distributed and homogenized throughout your clay body. Clay is made of different sized particles, as we know, plus silica particles and fluxing particles. If your clay isn't mixed well, you can end up with pockets of flux and no clay, or pockets of large clay particles here and small clay particles there. All of this can affect both the clay's working properties and fired results. The better your clay is mixed, the better it will perform. This is not unlike the importance of mixing glazes really well, as described in this blog post. So if you click this link here, it takes you to a blog post I wrote about the importance of mixing your glazes really well. You essentially want your clay reclaim to be a big bucket of liquid clay slip that you can mix with a drill and paint mixing attachment. The more fluid it is, the better it will be mixed. The reason why your reclaim could possibly be better than fresh clay out of the bag is that clay companies don't tend to mix clay in a liquid state. It would take too much time to remove all the excess water. Clay companies have big fancy mixing machines, and they do what's called plastic mixing, where they add just enough water to get the clay to working consistency and mix it in a plastic state. It's basically like super wedging. The clay companies do a better job of mixing with their equipment than we can do by wedging, but mixing a liquid will always be more effective than mixing a solid. By definition, liquids can flow and solids can't. And since most of us don't have fancy mixing machines, the better the clay is mixed before we have to wedge it, the easier it will be for us. We have the ability to mix our reclaim really well when it's in a liquid state. When you're ready to recycle your clay, the first step is to use your drill and paint mixer attachment to mix it in the bucket. Mix it for a few minutes. The longer the better. Don't worry if your clay is slightly lumpy. We'll get rid of those lumps in the next step. But make sure your clay is fluid enough to move and pour out of the bucket. If it's not, add a bit more water and keep mixing. Just reading a comment. I think Martha Stewart uses the low resolution technique to diffuse the appearance of age. Well, you don't need that, but just consider the benefits of even less than optimal conditions. All right, so I might look like I'm in my 20s. I'm just going to have a sip of water. All right. The next step that most people are going to be resistant to, I imagine, is sieving your reclaim. Wait, what? Seriously? Yes, I sieve my clay slip just like I would sieve a glaze, and I do this for 2 reasons. Reason number 1, my buddy. Our fuzzy companions are full of love, but they're also full of fuzz. And I just can't handle it when I find black dog hair in my white porcelain. It just bugs me a lot. So sieving my clay removes any hair or bugs or whatever else may have fallen into the bucket over time. Reason number 2, it makes the clay so nice and smooth, which also makes me happy. You can only sieve your clay if it's in a liquid state, otherwise it will take forever. Hopefully you added plenty of water during the mixing process. I usually mix and sieve my clay one day and then let it sit for at least a day. Once it's settled, then I can siphon off any excess water from the top before moving on to the next step. There's a balance between wet enough to mix well and so much water that it takes forever to dry. I like to add extra water for the mixing and sieving process and then remove as much as I can before the drying process. So now we have our Rubbermaid tote. I take my big Rubbermaid tote that fits my plaster slab and I put wooden blocks into the bottom. The blocks are there to raise the plaster up so there can be a bit of airflow underneath. This helps to speed up the drying process. If there's a lot of water, the water can drip out of the plaster, and we don't want the plaster sitting in a puddle because that will slow down the drying process. I like using a tote because it's portable and I can move it around my studio if I need to. I can also put the lid on to slow down the drying process if I need to. So if months are going to go by before I'm going to use this clay, I'll often put the lid on just so the clay doesn't dry out. And then I put the plaster slab on top of the blocks. And then I make a bed sheet bowl. So I take my old bed sheet and I drape it over the plaster. And then I use these plastic squeeze clamps to clamp the sheet onto the sides of the tote. Make sure that the sheet lays flat on top of the plaster. This creates a nice big bowl that I can pour the smooth clay into. Since the clay is so fluid, I don't have to worry about it leaking over the sides of the plaster. I can add a much thicker layer this way. Pour the clay. So then you pour the liquid clay into the big fabric bowl. So once the clay is in there, then I take the sides of the bed sheet and wrap them over top of the clay. So I carefully remove one clamp at a time, and I fold the two long sides of the sheet over the clay and then the ends, wrapping the wet clay up like a present. Then I let it sit. It usually takes a few weeks to get to wedging consistency in my cold studio. Times will vary depending on your studio environment. If you want to speed up the drying, you can put a fan on it. Just keep checking that it's not drying out too much. Once the bottom has firmed up a little, but still quite soft, I flip the whole thing over and allow it to dry from the other side. I continue to flip it over every now and then. One side is drying from the air and the other side is drying from the water being sucked out into the plaster. One thing the sheet is great for is it prevents the edges from drying faster than the middle. The sheet helps to keep the moisture content fairly even. So if you've ever been drying out your clay reclaim and the edges of the reclaim, they turn really hard and crunchy before the middle has dried out at all. And so this helps to prevent those crunchy edges. I'll often roll the clay in the sheet with my hands, trying to mix the drier outer layer with the softer clay in the middle. If I have a dry plaster slab handy and I'm trying to speed things up, I'll trade the wet slab for the dry. The bed sheet makes it really easy to do this. So you can just literally pick up the bed sheet and move your clay around if you need to. And it doesn't make a mess. You don't have to have two plaster slabs, but if you do, it will speed up the process. Because as one plaster slab becomes saturated with water, then you can move your clay to the dry slab so that it continues to absorb that moisture from the clay. Or you can do two batches at once if you have two plaster slabs. If you're going to be pouring plaster, I recommend making the most of it and pouring two slabs. I tend to the clay in these ways, making sure it dries evenly until it's ready to be wedged. Then I bag it up and it's ready to go. Nice, smooth plastic clay ready to be made into whatever I want. So here is a recap of my 9-step clay recycling system. Number 1, make a plaster slab. Number 2, what to put in your reclaim bucket, which is everything. all your clay scraps, everything. Mix your reclaim bucket. Then you sieve your reclaim. Then you put your wooden blocks into the tote. The plaster slab goes on top of the wooden blocks. Then you make the bedsheet bowl. Pour the clay into the bedsheet bowl, and then you wrap the clay in the bedsheet, flip it until it's wedgeable. Question, do you have wire in your slab? No wire in my slab. So I literally just take that plastic tote, a blue plastic tote, and I pour my slab, the plaster directly into the tote, about 2 inches, let it dry, and then it just kind of pops out of the bottom. So that is it. That brings us to the end of the article. I hope this either helps you improve your recycled clay or motivates you to tackle those reclaim buckets that you've been neglecting in your studio. We've all been there. Having a good system makes it easy. So that is the end of this article, and I'm happy to answer any questions if you have any. Just checking the chat here. I don't see any questions, so that might be it. So I just want to thank you for joining me in my very first ceramic story time with Sue. I'm going to work on the tech issues. I'm not sure what is up with my video, but I'll look into it and see if I can fix it before next week. So if you have any requests for blog posts that I've already written that you want me to read to you, I'm happy to hear those. And I just plan to do this every Friday or maybe Saturdays. I might switch it up just for people's schedules. And I'm just going to chip away at reading all of my blog posts. So thank you so much. I'm just reading back. So if you missed the beginning, then this video will be available to watch once I turn this live off. Then you can go back and watch the replay. Yes, so you can catch the first 17 minutes. And then I'm also going to upload this video and an audio version onto my website attached to the blog post. So you can always go back and watch it later if you like to listen to audio while you're walking or something like I do. I like to listen to podcasts. So that's kind of why I was doing this. I wanted to make different formats for my blog posts for different ways that people can read and watch and listen to them. So thank you for joining me, and I hope you have a wonderful Friday, and I will see you next time. Bye.